Welcome to Emvpanayv. I'm Gary Fife, Jaho Jifkados. Welcome to Mr. J.D. Colbert, who is our guest today. And he is here to talk to me about the book he's written, the look into, let's say it's a fictional book called Between Two Fires. Looking at the oil situation, theft, and land grab that affected Mvskoke people. So while everyone is kind of crowing over killers of the flower moon, we want to talk about it as it affected our own people. And I understand that movie is not doing that well in a box office.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Yeah, well, maybe the Osages will come to the rescue. First of all, tell me about your book. Which would you prefer, Mr. Colbert or J.D.?
Yes, just J.D., Gary. Of course, we've known each other a long time, so I feel like we can be informal in that way.
Thank you, because I got tired of being called Mr. Fife.
So yeah, I published this book about a year ago now. I think it was November of last year. And as you alluded to, it is very similar to Killers, although it tells the Creek story. Similar conspiracy to steal both even what might be termed legalized theft through guardianship of valuable Mvskoke Creek lands, oil wealth, and that included, sad to say, murders and suspicious death, probably poisoning of a number of Creek allottees to get at their wealth. There is, I do like to point out the similarities, my book, between Two Fires, the Creek murders, and the birth of the oil capital of the world. It's similarities to Killers, but there are also some notable differences. And in this case, in my book, the two key characters, the two protagonists, are Native. And so what I endeavored to do was to tell a Creek story from a Creek perspective and a Creek history, rather than what we've seen for far too long, the treatment of Natives in the media, and particularly movies, where Native stories are seemingly always told from a white point of view. Natives are just victims and collateral damage to the story. So in this case, we have two male and female protagonists, both Native. And part of the story is this, at the center of the story, I guess one could say, is this passionate and tempestuous love affair that develops between the male protagonist and the female as they are investigating stories of corruption, of murder, of legalized theft, the guardianship system, and they discover a grand conspiracy to steal Creek allotments in the Glenpool. We know the city of Glenpool. Not too many people, sad to say, know there was such a thing as the Glenpool, which at the time in the early 1900s was the largest reservoir of oil in the world, ultimately produced something like 500 million barrels of oil. And this conspiracy is led by John Simmons, the mayor, and there was a real actual John Simmons, mayor of Tulsa, and his oil bearer and cronies who stumble upon the Glenpool, and they try to stitch together a monopoly over the whole field by hook, by crook, leases, what have you, especially before the other greedy oilmen find out what's going on out there. And so the male protagonist, Sam Davis, the female protagonist, Zitkala, even as they're carrying on this tempestuous love affair and they battle in each other, they also find themselves battling Mayor Simmons and his cronies to try to prevent the theft. And the final piece of the summary that I like to give, Gary, is that when you reach down even deeper into the story that I tell, at base, really, it's one man's search for his identity. Sam Davis is a Creek half-breed. At a time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, being a half-breed might even have been worse than being a full-blood. because you weren't white, you weren't native, you were somewhere in this gray area. And Sam is, I imbue in him a fundamental lie that he believes in. And that lie that drives his life, it drives his actions, it drives his goals and his aspirations, is that if he can just attain enough wealth, frankly, by selling out his tribespeople, then he will ultimately be admitted into white society in Tulsa and will have found nirvana. And that's basically the story.
Right. That's, I think, unfortunately, being somewhat repeated today. I was trying to reach this Stahiki nirvana. The parallels between this and the big Scorsese production are pretty very strong. It's just, some people just say you just change the tribe and put it in a fictionalized fashion. But I remember seeing a comment you made about how the book draws 90% of its material from the actual history there.
Yes, it's in the genre of historical fiction, but yeah, 90% of the people, the events I portray actually happen. And historical fiction is generally defined as telling a story predicated on actual history, real people who lived, events that happened. But the fiction part comes when you essentially invent a plot through which you're bringing in these historical characters and events. I don't think, and certainly that the plot that I weave in the book isn't too far from reality either. So frankly, in some cases, my book has been labeled as nonfiction. And it's made the bestseller list that comes out weekly. Initially, it was in the fiction category. Then it got moved to nonfiction. So perhaps I do say that, yeah, in many ways I did invent the plot, but I think it was so close to reality that many do consider it actual history.
The story is so strong there that I think it affects anyone who has become familiar with it now, from Scorsese's film to your book here. And I understand this would be a good subject for another movie. But
yes, thank you.
That would be some speculation maybe we'll get to at some point.
I can say that I have signed a copy, and it was delivered through an intermediary to Taylor Sheridan of Yellowstone fame. So I think there are some who are beginning to look at it in that light in terms of a possible movie.
Yeah. Now, the story you tell has got to be having its effect on you, perhaps when you were creating the story there. Were there points there where you got mad and say, why am I doing this? Like, who's going to pay attention? How did it affect you?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And the genesis, the origination of the story in my book, I like to say, truthfully, is probably some 60 years in the making. I grew up at a time, came of age in the early to mid 60s. And when I was growing up in Creek community, primarily in Claremore, although we were always going around Creek country for this, that, and the other. In any event, at that time frame, let's say mid 60s, there were still a lot of the original Latis who were alive, who then were probably in their mid 60s, their 70s, their 80s. And so they told me firsthand their stories, their family stories. And while there were certain facts that were different from story to story, in too many ways they were all the same thing. Oil was discovered on their allotment. before they knew what was going on, a guardian had been appointed for them and essentially took over their life, leased out the land, otherwise perhaps legally stole it. So there were all of these stories that I had heard. And yeah, and of course, certainly even when I was like 10 years old, that hearing that made me very angry. And I suppose in the back of my mind, for decades, I had wanted to tell this story. And finally, all these years later, it seemed like, particularly with the interest in Killers of the Flower Moon, but other Native stories that had finally gotten swept out from under the rug and brought more into the public consciousness. A couple of years ago, there could not be a better time for me to tell this story that's been buried in the back of my mind. And in so doing, what I strived to do, Gary, was to be the voice of the dispossessed original Latis, to tell their story, to tell what happened to us.
The time period you mentioned that really affected you and took this teeny tiny spark and turned it into a fire. The period there was the growth of Native American activism. The American Indian movement hit the streets of Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there was the occupation of Alcatraz. And then later beyond that was Wounded Knee.
Right.
The Grecian novitiate in upper, was it New York? Did that affect you? Did that sort of drive you along and say, I've got to get this done, or this story needs to be told? What was the effect on you then?
Yeah, so in the events you just mentioned, certainly Wounded Knee, the Alcatraz, the occupation of the BIA building in D.C., all of these happened in my formative teenage years. I was still in high school. And certainly I had a proclivity toward activism, to join our brothers and sisters and to try to reform a system that had become, as you well know, and I'm sure most of our listeners, quite oppressive in many, many ways. Among other things, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had their thumb on all the tribes, and seemingly one could not go to the restroom without asking the BIA's permission.
Mm-hmm.
And so the flowering of Native activism, which, as you know, again, also led to policies changes and important federal laws that began to empower the tribes, was a wonderful kind of a reawakening and a flowering of our tribal governments and us as Native citizens. And yeah, I was very deeply affected by that, and I did things that I guess in my small way might have perhaps have helped move that along. And later working in tribal government, but also primarily many years as a banker financing projects in Indian country. I've been really pleased to see the growth, the resurgence of the tribal governments, ours here at Creek Nation, but all across the nation. Interestingly, and again, as you know, Gary, there's Angie DeBow wrote a book about the Creeks called The Road to Disappearance. And while I can't, and which you can understand our time frame, the book was published in 1949. Creek Nation, of course, doesn't at all resemble today what it was in 1949. And I'm not, unfortunately, at liberty to give a lot of details, but I can say that I'm collaborating with some other Creeks on a book that our working title right now is The Road to Reappearance.
Yeah.
And telling the story of the resurgence of the tribe rising, I like to say, phoenix-like from the ashes of ethnic cleansing, termination, de facto termination, all those kinds of things. So, yeah, all of those events that you mentioned have been a huge influence in my life.
A little closer to home, perhaps. There's been a wonderful development, as you mentioned, in tribes taking over their own lives. Self-determination, the Indian Self-Determination Act was a piece of that. And we put a generation of young people through college. And now many of them have assumed positions of leadership. Things ain't way they used to be with appointed leadership across the nation of Indian tribes by the BIA or Interior. People are saying, no, we don't need, that's got to go. Although there are a few dinosaurs hanging on here and there, but a lot of that has changed. And do you see then stories like this gaining more interest, more people wanting to know what happened then? What do you think?
Absolutely. A lot of interest. And I can say I've probably done by now, 30 or 40 author talks, and primarily in Oklahoma, but some outside. But in terms of, say, Oklahoma, and particularly Tulsa, where this story is set, I knew when the book came out that I could definitely count on the Native community having my back and supporting me greatly in telling the story. The book, although of course is definitely an indictment of, let's just say, white people in power. And so I admit I had some trepidation in sallying forth to a mainly white audience to tell this story, frankly expecting some blowback. But across all these dozens of presentations, primarily to white audiences, the story's been really, really embraced. People seem they're finally ready to hear this story. And that's probably been the biggest surprise of the book and my related talks, is just how, I would say, across the board, people have embraced the story. They want to know it. They've written me emails and reviews, particularly on Amazon, all been very, very favorable. So, it's been a surprise, but it's been a really, really good surprise to get that reaction.
Let me do my...
Well, Gary, we've got some questions.
Oh, you got questions, great.
So the first one is from T.Y. Prohl. He's asking, post-McGirt, to reclaim the unallotted expired town sites on the Mvskoke Reservation, should new tribal towns be established on the boundaries under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act?
New tribal
No, I was going to say, that's quite a mouthful.
Yeah, it is.
Can you solve all of our problems?
Yeah. Well, I can say I don't know the legalities. I'm not an attorney, although like any Native person working in Indian country, you kind of become a de facto attorney because we're having to deal with all these laws and case decisions. Oh my God, it goes on and on. But I, for one, would be very supportive of the reestablishing tribal towns. We have of course our chartered communities. I'm my own point of view, my own opinion is I'm very sympathetic to our historical governance through tribal towns. And I think to the extent that we can either reestablish those and or empower the ones we do have, say more programs, more businesses, more activity at that tribal town level, I would definitely be in favor of that.
Okay, got two more questions. T.Y. Prohl is asking, are you familiar with the lore of Billy Bruner, material ripe for development along the lines of what Bass Reeves is given?
Yeah, Billy Bruner, and I have foggy memories. I know of Billy Bruner. I'm vaguely aware of his story. I'm trying to remember. Seems like he got sent to prison for killing a U.S. Marshal who came to arrest him out near, Sapulpa, south of Sand Springs, somewhere out there. Billy Bruner eventually, if I recall correctly, I think he received a presidential pardon from the first Roosevelt president, became somewhat of a celebrity, was out telling his story. But unfortunately, I don't remember enough of Billy's story to be able to fully answer the question.
Okay, got one more question from the chat. T.Y. Pearl again, also asking, do you have any honka stories about the creek hanging tree by the BOK Center?
Oh, yeah. I don't have specific honka stories. I do know of the tree, and it's still there. It's in a kind of a small industrial warehouse district, not far from the BOK Center.
Mhm.
And of course, that was used to hang creeks and others back in the day. And interestingly, must have been very, very close, but the first Miko of Lojaboga, after the Trail of Tears, whose name escapes me, I'll probably think of it in a moment, but he lived within the shadow of the hanging tree. And so there definitely could be some stories there. I don't know of any. I can say that with very, very good documented foundation, that it seems very clear to me that the first Miko, can't believe I can't remember his name, but in any event, I have pretty strong evidence that he is buried under the sanctuary of First United Methodist Church at 11th and Boulder. And there used to be a creek cemetery there.
Right over there, big monument to Methodism.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Well, we had one more question pop up while you're answering that one. T.Y. Pearl asks, are you familiar, I'm going to try to pronounce this, T.Y. Are you familiar with the books Okzuna by Turgev Jorgensen and Tukabuchi, The Spirit of My Soul, A Tale of the Allotment Era by Tatiana Duncan?
Oh, yeah. The former, no, I'm not familiar with. The latter, yes. Tatiana is a good friend of mine. I contributed some material to her. That Tukabuchi is her great-great-grandfather. Maybe there's three greats in there. Tukabuchi was this amazing Creek medicine man warrior who reportedly lived to about 110 years old, died in 1910. He had his allotment where the gathering place is today.
Mm-hmm.
And Tatiana and I have been trying to get his story more front and center, because I tell the Tulsans that if you don't know the story of Tukabuchi, you don't know the history of Tulsa. I'm sorry, you simply don't. And he is at ground zero of that town's history.
Mm-hmm.
And when he died in 1910, his obituary was covered by dozens and dozens of newspapers in Oklahoma and outside of, and it was described as his passing was like that of the legendary Geronimo. I mean, he had that esteem and fame.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story about Geronimo.
Yeah, yes.
You know, we asked the people at the now Gathering Place Park when they first began to open it whether or not they had recognized the property as having these links to Native people.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of hemmed and hawed,
Mm-hmm.
looked a little embarrassed, but thought, okay, I'm happy with that. We'll let you off the hook. Now, something like this has got to be a bit of a polarizing element. I mean, as I was going to say earlier, my usual other side of the coin question is if you had any bad reaction, people saying, it happened so long ago, why are they still, crying about that kind of thing? Has that been your experience at all?
No, not at all. And I mentioned that most of my talks have been to really exclusive non-natives.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them right there in Maple Ridge, which was also Tukabuchi's land. It's the hoity-toity area of Tulsa. Yeah. The oil mansions and so forth. I've gone into the heart of Maple Ridge, talked to like their garden clubs and social clubs, and they have they want to know this history. And when I explain it to them, tell them, like you said, Gary, and primarily their response is, "Oh my God, I've lived here in this Maple Ridge all my life. I never knew any of this."
Yeah.
And I tend to say too, well, if you own a house in Maple Ridge, then get your abstract, start flipping through it. The first document you'll find is the patent deed from the United States of America to Mvskoke Creek Nation for 3 million acres. The next document you will find is an allotment deed. And so start doing your research and find out who your allottee is. And then you can get online, you can look at the Dawes rolls, look up their names, and begin to get to know that allottee and the person whose wealth was stolen that effectively you have inherited.
Or your family had perhaps ripped it off.
Yeah, exactly. It could be.
Yeah,
Totally.
that's a rather indelicate way of dealing with it. As we heard earlier, you might be looking at a companion book to Between
Yes.
Two Fires.
Yes. Actually, yeah. My goal is to do a 3-part series, 3-book series. There was so much material that happened in the former Indian Territory, especially in and around Tulsa. So much happened between the creation of the Dawes rolls and the executing of the allotments, like 1901, 1902, the discovery of oil at the Red Fork at the Sioux Bland number 1, then in 1905, especially in 1905, at the Glen Pool at the Ida Glen number 1, who of course was a Creek allottee, when thousands of people moved into Tulsa, and I like to say Tallahassee, Old Town, that 500-year-old Tallahassee, this Creek village, Creek tribal town, the Creeks got overrun, they got outnumbered, and ultimately got pushed out of their 500-year-old town. And so I very much concentrate on that time period. Anyway, there was so much things that happened, I simply couldn't put it in one book. And I decided this deserves a 2 or 3 book series on different elements. And so my next book, what I'm looking at is the whole guardianship system that was used to legally despoil natives of their lands and of their wealth. Badly abused, so many cases. And every one of those cases, and we all as Native people, I think, have these stories, particularly here in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, all of these thefts, all the guardianship, everything that was stolen can be traced to one act, which is known as the crime of 1908, where also known as the Act of May 27, 1908, where at the urging of Oklahoma's new 6-month-old state and their congressional delegation, they agitated in Congress and got Congress to pass that act, which basically transferred control over Native affairs from the federal level to the state level, especially the county level. Primarily, it did 2 things. It removed protective restrictions from 60,000 of the 100,000 allotments that had been done throughout Indian Territory. And it moved probate matters to county courts and empowered county judges to appoint their country club buddies as guardians over natives. This is ground zero for the grand conspiracy of theft, is this act. And so I really want to kind of center a story around the crime of 1908.
Have you ever taken this story to Glenpool? I understand they've got quite an extensive investment in their Indian education section there in the schools. And I've never got the sense that I live in Glenpool, by the way.
Okay.
And there hasn't been any recognition
Any
of
reckoning of the past?
Hey, guess what? You stole it fair and square, didn't you?
Exactly.
Have you ever?
No,
had it?
I haven't gotten to do a talk in Glenpool. I would definitely love to do that. So, Gary, if you can hook me up, I will be there.
Well, let me see what we can do. They haven't
Okay.
even talked to this living legend yet.
I had a question pop up in the chat if you guys want to talk.
Sure, we'll wrap it up with this question.
So T.Y. Pearl's asking, should everyone on an Indian Territory reservation know whose allotment they live on, and do you know whose allotment you live on?
Yes and yes. And that's a project that they mentioned Lucinda Hickory. I helped her start the Lucinda Hickory Research Institute, and the singular goal of the Research Institute is to tell the stories of the allottees, one by one. And so, yes, I very much believe that anybody, particularly in the Creek Reservation, that owns lands should know the history of that land back to the original lottee.
The last question, we'll get out of your way here. I've always found, an examination of that history, and you mentioned Angie Debo's work. The early governing families, dynasties, if you will, and the oil companies that we're so proud of, all had a hand in this dark procedure, shall we say.
Absolutely, they did.
And is there some way we can make them aware of it, or pop that balloon of romanticism, perhaps?
Well, yeah. And
books like this?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And frankly, that's also something that inspired me to write the book. Mainly it was my history, knowing the original lottees, but also, to your point, a lot of these so-called now esteemed founding fathers of Tulsa, Sand Springs, you name it. I haven't documented this, so I'm not going to say all of them were involved, but the vast majority. And the buildings left behind, those Art Deco buildings that people love, and I can see the beauty there, but as a Mvskoke Creek, I see Creek blood on the walls of those buildings. And so, yeah, I think that instead of these people, and I mentioned Charles Page, and in my book, the character Chuck Book, it's pretty easy to compare to figure out that's Charles Page, that rather than being held in such high esteem, the truth about these individuals needs to be known and how they acquired their wealth.
Right. I always kind of wonder about that every time I drive through South Tulsa, over by Woodward Park in particular.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, I tell you what, we want to thank you so much, JD, for coming in and talking about it. It sounds like a story that's still ongoing, and there will be more discussions in the future, and perhaps we'll have get an opportunity to have you back and talk about those.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gary, for inviting me to the show. It's always good to see you. Enjoy sharing this message. And yes, a number of us natives, particularly native writers, are determined to keep telling these stories, more stories, in various forms, books, movies, videos, you name it. We're committed to getting the native story into greater awareness among the general public.
Okay. JD, once again, 2,000 Mados for being with us today. We appreciate it.
And
we hope to talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Again, thank you for having me on the show.
Okay, and thank you, viewers, listeners, for joining us here. We'll have more of this sort of discussion in future editions of Emvpanayv. And, of course, I want to say a thank you to Jared Moore for guiding us through the technicalities there and being such an important part of this program.